approving everything that they do? And the Bible repeatedly answers yes. But that never excuses the flaws, though, right? Let me confess. One of my favorite apologists followed him for many, many years, had a moral fall, and all his work is taken down from almost every bookstore. Now, if you look at his work, he's got some great work that's out there, but you'll never see the light of day anymore because of that moral fall. I make no excuses for the person, but look at how the enemy can work, right? One wrong mistake and everything that you worked hard for is gone. We're in a spiritual warfare. We're in a spiritual battle. And so one of the things I do is I still read a lot of the books that he wrote. And one time I was up at the pulpit and I said, one of my favorite authors. And I quoted him from the front. And usually nobody would come up and ask, like, a reference, like usually if I gave the name and gave the author, then they'll take it down. Now, this one lady, she meant well. She came up to me and she said, "Oh, that was such a great quote. Can you give me the name of the author?" And when I gave the name of the author, she said, "Oh." Oh. So Whitfield's greatness points us to God's grace. Whitfield's failures remind us why even revivalists still need it. And so Whitfield preached that every human being needed the grace of God. History reminds us that included George Whitfield himself, that when we come to the final years of his life, the man who spent 30 years crossing the ocean between Britain and America. This guy went back and forth 13 times. Preached thousands of sermons. And a lot of people was worried about his health because he would constantly be on the go preaching almost 2 or 3 times a day. And this man would preach as if he had like 30,000 people would hear him preach. That's how loud his voice was. His final years, 1745 to 1770, a life poured out for the gospel. As Whitfield entered the final decades of his ministry, one thing became increasingly clear. He was wearing himself out. He had preached across Britain and America for more than 30 years. He had crossed the Atlantic 13 times, traveled thousands of miles on horseback and by ship, and preached to audiences that no preacher before him had ever reached. His body was failing, but he refused to slow down. Unlike Wesley, though, who spent much of his ministry organizing societies throughout Britain, Whitfield remained primarily an evangelist, an itinerant preacher, a missionary to the English-speaking world. He continued to make repeated journeys between England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and the American colonies. Harry Stout describes Whitfield as living a life of ceaseless motion. That phrase actually captures him perfectly. He never settled. He never pastored one congregation permanently. He believed that his parish was actually the whole world. And Wesley built churches. Whitfield kept them moving. And so his health begins to fail. Years of travel began taking their toll, and Whitfield suffered from asthma, chronic respiratory illness, physical exhaustion, and frequent illness. So often he preached despite being seriously unwell, and friends would urge him to, hey, let's take a rest. And he never listened to any of them, because Whitfield seemed willing to spend every remaining ounce of his strength saying that, hey, I'm going to preach for Jesus. And he always thought that he was going to be immortal until God was done with him. So Whitfield measured his life not by the years, but by the sermons that he was preaching at the time. he would often say these words, "I would rather wear out than rust out." That was one of the sayings that he was known for. Life was meant to be spent, not preserved, right? And so in 1770, Whitefield returns once more to America, and he's 55 years old at this time. His voice is weakening. He doesn't have the same power that he had before. His breathing, people can hear from a distance. He's struggling. His friends again urge him, "Whitefield, you've got to stop." And instead, the man continues to preach. And so one evening, after arriving at the old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport, people gathered outside asking him to preach. What do you think he does? Well, he's exhausted, but he's also not going to refuse them. And so, according to tradition, he stands on the courthouse, steps out, and preaches by candlelight. It was actually his final sermon. And he delivers it with urgency that had marked his entire ministry. He preached until he had nothing left to give. And so on that morning of September 30, 1770, George Whitefield dies, and he's 55 years old. So there's something profoundly symbolic here, right? Because he dies not in retirement, not at home, not after withdrawing from his ministry. Like, this man dies in the midst of his preaching tour. And so, still serving, still proclaiming Christ, Arno Dellamore writes, he literally died in the harness. And so, that is one of the best summaries of Whitefield's life. Now, his burial, Whitefield was buried beneath the pulpit of the old South Presbyterian Church there at Newburyport. Even today, visitors can descend beneath the church to go and see the tomb. It's fitting for this man because he spent his whole life preaching from a pulpit, and now he's resting beneath one. And so Whitefield's death shocked both Britain and America because a short life, right? Short life. And yet thousands of lives were impacted by his. And newspapers across the Atlantic reported his passing. And so Benjamin Franklin reflected on his remarkable influence. And John Wesley, despite years of theological disagreement, preached a memorial sermon honoring him. And that was the sermon I was telling you about, where he just speaks about how godly this man was to Wesley and the other boys that they were part of, that whole Methodist club. And so Wesley declared, "Have we read or heard of any person since the apostles who testified the gospel of grace through so widely extended a place?" Coming from Wesley, there have been no greater compliment. Imagine having John Wesley preach at your sermon, at your funeral, right? And so Whitefield's legacy, by 1770, Whitefield had crossed the Atlantic 13 times, preached approximately 18,000 sermons. He had been heard by hundreds, thousands personally, and likely millions indirectly through print and reports. Remember, Benjamin Franklin spread this guy's pamphlets everywhere. And he helped ignite the first Great Awakening, and he's influenced nearly every Protestant denomination in the English-speaking world. So Thomas Kidd writes, Whitefield was probably the most famous person in the British Atlantic world before the American Revolution. And so this is like extraordinary assessment, because before Washington, before Jefferson, before Franklin became internationally famous, Whitefield was arguably the best known public figure in Britain's Atlantic Empire. So what kind of spiritual lessons can we draw from Whitefield? Whitefield's death teaches something so profound in that he never founded a denomination. He never became a bishop. He also never became a political leader. He was just a preacher of the gospel. And again, he would never fail to preach. His greatness was not institutional, it was evangelical. Because Whitfield's monument was not actually a cathedral, it was the awakened hearts from Britain all the way to the American colonies. So what's the key question in this chapter? What does it look like to finish well? Whitfield's answer was simple. You gotta keep preaching Christ until you cannot preach Christ no more. And so Whitfield spent his life crossing oceans so that others might cross from death to life. And so we look at his influence in chapter 19, his influence on the American Revolution, the evangelist who helped shape a nation before it was actually born. Remember, when you look at the American colonies, all of them were independent. All of them had their own theology, they had their own leaders, had their own belief systems. And if you wanted to congregate with those who believed with you, you'd go to that place. Whitfield united them. For the very first time, Benjamin Franklin said, one man can unite 13 colonies, and he saw hope in that unity. And so he used Whitfield as a way to try and unite. He didn't believe in Whitfield's God, but he believed that Whitfield had the power to be able to bring everybody together. Whitfield never preached the revolution, though. So let's begin by correcting the common misconception. George Whitfield never preached about independence. He didn't know the American colonies would head in that direction. He never spoke about revolution, nor that he rebelled against Britain. In fact, he died in 1770. And the American Revolution officially began in 1775. So Whitfield never saw Lexington. He never saw Concord or Washington's army. He never got to see the Declaration of Independence. He never got to see that. So why do historians connect him to the revolution? It's because the revolution do not begin with wars. They begin with ideas. They begin with culture and identity, the way people think. Harry Stout writes, Whitfield was the first modern celebrity in America. That statement is bigger than it first appears because celebrities create shared conversations, shared identity, and shared culture. Whitfield created an intercolonial identity. Before Whitfield, the colonies thought locally. People were Virginians, Massachusetts men, Pennsylvanians, or Carolinians. Whitfield changed all of this. He preached Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. So for the first time, people across the 13 separate colonies heard the same preacher, the same message, and the same revival. And there were people that were blown away by this kind of unity. And so Thomas Kidd writes, Whitfield became the best known public figure in colonial America. Before Americans shared a political identity, they shared George Whitfield. And so Whitfield democratized religion. Whitfield preached to the farmers. Remember, there were a lot of people that weren't going to church anymore, unless you wanted to go to church to sleep. They had some of the worst preachers during this time in America. People were just going to church because it's what we do. And so you'd see churches were either empty or people were sleeping in the pews, and the preacher would come out there and he would preach sermons that he wasn't even convicted of. I had a lecturer when I was studying theology. when he would teach us Reformation, he would bring out his notes, and the paper that his notes were written on had become yellow. Like, he had been reading these same notes for years. And he just, when that class starts, he starts reading. And he doesn't stop reading until the end of the class. If you turn up late, you've missed a lot of notes. But he speaks in monotone. I mean, I was struggling to stay awake. And if you look at some of my notes that I took in that class, it starts off with good handwriting, then it looks like signatures. I'm just dozing off. So what preachers were like back then, until George Whitefield. And because he wasn't preaching inside the churches, he went outside and he began preaching outside. And so farmers got to hear. People who never went to church got to hear. People started coming closer and hearing him. Slaves, governors, merchants, women, laborers. He treated everyone as equally needed before God. And that was important because it reinforced a biblical truth. Every soul has equal value before God. And so this didn't create democracy, but it strengthened ideas that actually would support it. So Nathan Hatch argues that evangelical religion helped democratize American Christianity by elevating ordinary people rather than the established elites. Whitefield helped ordinary people believe, hey, my soul matters, my soul is important. That's a revolutionary idea, especially coming from Europe, where you have to be of like the elite class in order to be important. And so Whitefield changed established authority. Whitefield often preached outside of the church buildings without permission, across parish boundaries, against spiritually dead ministers. This taught people something, not intentionally political, but culturally significant. It taught them that authority should be respected, but not blindly. Truth stands above office. Does that sound familiar? Because that's exactly what John Knox was teaching. The Puritans, Roger Williams, and Hutchinson had all been teaching, all in different ways. And Whitefield did not attack authority. He simply refused to let authority replace truth. He would never go on the pulpit and start talking about all the errors that politicians are speaking about. He just preached truth, and truth would correct the error. And so Benjamin Franklin recognized it. Franklin admired Whitefield enormously, not because he became an evangelical Christian, but because he recognized Whitefield's extraordinary influence. So Franklin began printing his sermons, his journals, revival reports. He helped spread Whitefield's voice across America. And together they created something unprecedented: mass communication. Historian Frank Lambert argues that Whitefield's preaching tours helped create a shared public sphere throughout the colonial America. Again, planting those seeds that would later become useful in unifying the colonies. Whitefield connected people emotionally. Franklin connected them through print. So this revival produced courage. So the Great Awakening taught every person must answer directly to God. That has political implications, because if God is ultimate, no earthly ruler is ultimate then. Notice the progression, right? Notice the progression in our classes. Look, Knox said God is above kings. The Puritans said Scripture is above the institutions. And then later the Mayflower came and said the government by covenant. We have to come together. And then in Connecticut, authority comes from consent. And then you have Whitefield, who eventually comes and says every soul stands directly before God. Do you see the pattern that's happening here? And so this is not revolution. It is the worldview that makes liberty imaginable. So here's where historians debate the connection, though. See, because we have to be intellectually honest here. Some historians argue that the Great Awakening directly prepared the revolution, Others argue its influence was indirect. Most modern historians take the middle position. So Thomas Kidd writes that Whitefield and the Awakening helped create shared experience and networks that later proved significant. So notice the careful wording there. Not they caused the revolution, but they helped prepare the culture. So that's the balanced historical position. So the Christian perspective, though, Whitefield never intended to create a revolution. He intended to create converted people, but converted people end up thinking differently. They end up living differently. They end up questioning differently. This is an awakened people now. And they will end up acting differently. See, revival changed. The human heart had changed. Changed hearts eventually challenge society. Isn't that crazy? You can teach your kids things, and once your kids go off into school, they come back and you say something, they can challenge you with newfound education and understanding. I kind of like that, because you're grateful for the fact that your children are learning something and you can engage now in a conversation. People back then could not engage in conversations when it comes to matters of faith and matters of politics because they were ill-informed. You have a situation now where they're informed, and they're informed from the preachings of these great men like Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, and George Whitefield. So, what's the key question here? Can spiritual awakening change the course of a nation without ever preaching politics? Well, history suggests yes. Whitefield did not preach independence from Britain. He preached dependence on Christ. And dependent Christians eventually became independent citizens. George Whitefield never signed the Declaration of Independence. He never fired a musket. He never sat in the Continental Congress. Yet, by awakening the hearts of the colonies, he helped shape the kind of people who would one day believe that no king stands above God. No government stands above conscience. And no earthly authority can replace the authority of Christ. So, the revolution of America, far different from the French Revolution. When we look at the French Revolution and we look at the American Revolution and what drove these revolutions, you can see the American Revolution being so much different from that of the French. You have this idea of going back in American Revolution, like there's this revolve, like let's go, it's the understanding of going 360. Let's go back to the beginning. What does it mean to go back to the beginning? It means, what does it mean to be human? And when you ask the question, what does it mean to be human, you're also asking the question of, what does it mean to be governed? How do we build a society? And those questions are super important because they started to ask several questions in America. They wanted to understand, how do we define three things? First thing, how do we define virtue? Second, how do we define revolution? And thirdly, how do we define republic with a lower R? How do we define these terms? If we're going to establish a government, it's important for us to know the answers to these questions. Now, George Washington, after winning that great battle, March 15, he's with his soldiers, and his soldiers are saying to him, now it's time to become king. They say, George, or King George. George turned and looked at the soldiers that he was leading, and he had said to them, why did our men die? Like, are we repeating what they died for? And so he ended up quoting from a famous a famous play back then called the tragedy, the Cato tragedy. And that Cato tragedy play was probably the most famous play at the time. Now, most Protestants would never go to a play because they were suspicious of anything performance, right? So they wouldn't go to these plays. But most of the colonies were aware of this play that was happening in America, and they were very inspired by it. And it has Cato, who is this senator who's on the run, and Julius Caesar is chasing after him. He's the last remaining senator from the Republic, and he's hiding in northern Africa, of all places. And while he's hiding in northern Africa, he has a book of he has his hand in the middle of Plato's book, The Republic, and he does the speech. He says, "I'm going to die today. The Romans are coming. Julius Caesar is coming." I'm paraphrasing, and he says, "Today, the Republic is here. Tomorrow, the empire will come." And he says, when Julius Caesar comes, the empire will come with him, and the Republic will be gone. And these ideas of the Republic, he says, would echo down into the ages. And he says, one day, somebody will hear, and the Republic will be back again. George Washington says today's that day. Today's that day where we become a republic, but we have to define these terms. So that brings us to our final part of this class before we finish. We end George Whitefield, but we go into the birth of the American Republic. In chapter 1, we'll be looking at from Revolution to Republic, 1776 to 1787, you have a nation without a government. Now, remember when the Constitution was written and the Declaration of Independence, there's 13 years between there. What happened within that 13 years is so important for us to understand where we are today with what happened in that 13 years. And also, when you look at the Declaration of Independence, you have a little United next to the States of America. You have States of America in big, bold writings, and then very little United. It's like, why? What did they see? How did each of these colonies understand their independence? And so the independence was only the beginning, because on July the 4th, which is, we're approaching July the 4th again, right? 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the United States Declaration of Independence. This document did not create the United States government, but it did something different. It declared these 13 colonies no longer recognize the authority of the British Crown. My brother calls me up one time and says, "Hey man, what's it like to celebrate July the 4th over there?" I said, "Why is that?" He goes, "We're over here still celebrating the British. You're over there celebrating when you got rid of them." It always makes me laugh every time I think about that. I said, "Oh yeah, that's right. We're not under the British." Thomas Jefferson wrote the famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Now, if you were here in the class with John Knox and John Calvin, you'd know that those words are borrowed from John Calvin. The Declaration explains why independence was justified. It does not explain how the new nation would govern itself. So the distinction is essential, because the Declaration gave the U.S. its philosophy. The Constitution would later give the U.S. its government. Okay, stay with me. I know I'm speaking to Americans. The 13 independent states, after declaring independence, something surprising happens. There was no strong national government. Instead, there were still 13 independent states, 13 legislators, 13 governors, different economies, different interests. Each state had just escaped what it believed was an overreaching of a central government. The last thing most Americans wanted was another powerful national authority. Historian Gordon Wood writes it like this: "The revolution had been fought against concentrated power, and Americans naturally feared creating another." So they knew how to overthrow a king. They did not know how to build a republic. So the Revolutionary War continues. Many people forget that the Declaration did not end the war. The Revolutionary War continued until 1783. And during those years, the Continental Army struggled for supplies. Congress had very little money, and inflation was severe. Soldiers often went without pay. So the nation was fighting for survival while simultaneously trying to invent a government at the same time. So here's where George Washington steps in as leader. Washington became the indispensable leader of the revolution. Now, his greatest gift was not military. It was not military brilliance alone. It was perseverance. The historian James Thomas Flexner famously described Washington as the indispensable man. That title captures how many contemporaries viewed him. Washington won fewer spectacular victories than people imagined, but he refused to lose. So the first government, the Articles of the Confederation. So while the war continued, Congress drafted America's first Constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. Now, it was adopted in 1781. This is America's first national government. Now, notice, it's not the Constitution, it's the Articles. Why were the Articles so weak? Because Americans feared another king. The Articles deliberately created a weak central government, a strong state governments, and Congress could conduct foreign affairs. They could actually declare war. They could negotiate treaties, but Congress could not tax citizens directly, regulate interstate commerce, or force states to obey national decisions. This is before the Constitution. So the Articles solved one problem, tyranny. But they created another, weakness. So here's the great irony, was that the Revolution had taught Americans, never trust unlimited government. The Articles taught Americans, you cannot survive without effective government. So this tension becomes the central political question of the next decade. So Knox, let me summarize, said no king stands above God. Puritans, government exists under covenant. Mayflower Compact, the people covenant together under God. Connecticut, authority comes through the consent of the government. Now those ideas become national questions. How do you create liberty, order, and justice without creating another monarchy? Well, Mark Knoll observes that many American political assumptions were deeply shaped by Protestant ways of thinking about covenant. So moral responsibility and accountable government. So founders were not inventing government from nothing. Watch this. They were building upon centuries of Christian political reflection. And so between 1776 and 1787, America lived under an experiment. Could 13 sovereign states remain united without a strong national government? The answer slowly became a clear no. The Articles had preserved liberty, but they had failed to preserve unity. That realization would eventually bring the nation's greatest political minds together in Philadelphia with the key question: how do you preserve liberty without creating chaos? That is the defining political question of the founding era. And it has never really disappeared, guys. Stay with me. The Declaration of Independence declared America free. The next 11 years taught Americans that freedom alone could not hold a nation together. So the next question became unavoidable. And this is where we're going to land and finish today. If the Articles of Confederation are failing, how do we fix them? the answer would become one of the most remarkable political gatherings in history. I'll see you next week. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for your blessings. I pray, Lord, that you'll continue to guide us and help us to reflect on history and to look at how you have moved in the past and where you are today. And Lord, the Bible is history so that we can see how you have moved and where you are going. And so, Lord, help us to keep our eyes on you. And may we see Jesus return soon. In Jesus' name, amen.